Harry and Meghan have quite literally created an even more of a bigger bubble to do with those children, to do with the surrogacy rumors, to do with how old they are, where they are, and things like that, because they're constantly playing games. They have used the children to weaponize them against the royal family.
The royal family would not be coming to Harry's rescue. They would not be funding a divorce to any extent. And they, at this point, wouldn't really care what Meghan tried to say or do, because Meghan has so discredited herself as a liar, a cheat, and a phony. That bump had more ups and downs than Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's marriage. I'd never known another woman of colour or another woman without colour to have performed in a pregnancy the way Meghan did. Anything to do with those children and how they came into existence would have possibly racial implications, when of course it's nothing to do with that at all.
Harry and Meghan have created an even bigger bubble around their children. The surrogacy rumors, the questions about their ages, where they are, and the way information about them is handled have only made the matter more suspicious in the eyes of the public. The accusation presented here is that they have kept playing games and have used the children as a weapon against the royal family. Because of that, what may once have seemed like a limited suspicion has grown into a much larger public concern. In this account, the royal family would not come to Harry's rescue, would not meaningfully fund a divorce, and at this point would not be overly concerned about whatever Meghan might say or do, because she has so thoroughly discredited herself that her credibility is seen as deeply damaged. Her pregnancy presentation is described as so unusual that many people stopped seeing it as normal at all. It is said that the bump moved and behaved in ways that did not seem natural, and the speaker claimed she had never seen another woman perform a pregnancy the way Meghan did. For that reason, everything connected to the children and the circumstances of their births has become a major question, though the argument insists that none of this has anything to do with race. The central claim in this narrative is that Buckingham Palace receives more letters about this subject than about the cost of the monarchy, royal succession, or any political scandal involving the institution. The topic generating all this attention is Meghan Markle's pregnancies, especially the births of Archie and Lilibet, and whether the public story about those births stands up to scrutiny. This is not framed as a fringe obsession or the concern of a tiny handful of skeptics, but as a sustained, organized, and passionate wave of public concern that has been building for years. According to this version of events, people keep writing in, the palace receives the letters are read, and yet nothing meaningful is ever said in response. That silence has only made the whole issue more uncomfortable and more persistent, and it keeps leading back to the same difficult question: why? Lady Colin Campbell is presented as one of the earliest and most persistent voices raising concerns about this matter. She is described as someone who paid a price for doing so. She was mocked, dismissed, and branded a conspiracy theorist, but she never stepped back from her position. What has changed now, according to this account, is that she is no longer the only establishment voice saying these questions deserve real answers. Hugo Vickers has now entered the conversation, and that is treated as a major turning point. He is not introduced as just another commentator, but as one of Britain's most respected royal historians, a man personally close to Queen Elizabeth II, a verger at St. George's Chapel, and a genuine insider with decades of experience around royal events. Because he is known as careful, measured, and deeply embedded in the establishment world, his decision to raise concerns is portrayed as especially significant. The position attributed to Hugo Vickers is that Meghan Markle used a surrogate. According to the transcript, this has been discussed for years in relation to both Archie and Lilibet. The subject is described as a running sore within the royal family, and it is further claimed that the palace has received more correspondence on this issue than on any other. People are encouraged to keep writing in, because the more pressure the palace feels from public correspondence, the more likely it may become that the royal family will confront what is repeatedly called the elephant in the room. The most striking anomaly raised in connection with Hugo Vickers concerns the birth timeline. Meghan is described as appearing to be the only woman in recorded history who gave birth and then went into labor afterward. According to the public timeline being referenced, the birth was announced first and labor came afterward. The argument insists there is no medical explanation for such a sequence. It is presented not as a matter of personal dislike or political interpretation, but as a factual anomaly sitting openly in the public record, without any satisfactory explanation. What gives Hugo Vickers' intervention such weight in this telling is not only what he said, but who he is, and what it may cost him to say it. Lady Colin Campbell explains that he is not someone who can simply speak bluntly and walk away without consequence. His standing, his access, his reputation, and his place within the wider royal establishment rest on relationships that he has built over many years. For someone in that position to say what he said is therefore framed as a deliberate and calculated move, not an offhand remark. In her reading, what he is really saying, once one translates it out of the cautious language of the establishment, is that the birth timeline raises serious questions of fraudulence. The basic point is presented very simply. Nobody can give birth after already having given birth. The matter does not stop at the timeline. Archie Mountbatten Windsor's birth announcement is said to have been posted without a single witness signature. This is not described as a minor technical omission, but as a serious constitutional departure. Witness signatures are presented as something that had once been mandatory, even in the case of Queen Elizabeth II, whose births were properly witnessed and fully documented. The historical record is described as clear on that point. That is why the absence of this kind of documentation in Archie's case is treated not as an innocent oversight, but as a deliberate break from procedures that existed for very specific and serious constitutional reasons. To explain why any of this matters beyond royal gossip, the narrative reaches back to the year 1689 and the warming pan scandal. At that time, a king's son was said to have been smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan, creating the fear of a substitute child, an imposter heir, and a dynasty built on deception. Whether that story was entirely true is treated as almost beside the point, because the doubt itself became powerful enough to reshape the political life of a nation. That is the reason witnessed royal births became part of constitutional tradition. They were not mere pageantry or empty ritual, but safeguards designed to ensure that no one could ever again question whether the person in the line of succession truly belonged there. In that historical light, Meghan's pregnancy behavior is described as extremely strange, and whatever happened is said to have been far from normal. Whether the issue involved padding, manipulation, or something more serious, the transcript insists there is a hidden story waiting to come out. For more than 300 years, the system of witnessed royal births is said to have protected both the institution and the public. Then, in the modern era, the role of the Home Secretary as official witness was removed on the assumption that no member of the royal family would ever create the need for such oversight again. That decision is described as an act of trust, but Lady Colin Campbell regards it as naive. In her view, centuries of healthy skepticism were discarded because people assumed those inside the institution would always behave as previous generations had done. The possibility that someone might enter the institution without sharing those values and might treat the absence of safeguards not as a gesture of goodwill but as an opportunity was never seriously considered. According to this argument, it should have been, because that is exactly the possibility now haunting the institution. Archie is now 7 years old, and Lilibet is said to be turning 5 next month, yet both still sit in the line of succession. At the same time, according to the transcript, vast numbers of people continue writing to the palace, asking whether their constitutional position is legitimate. This is described not as a radical question, but as precisely the kind of question the old system existed to prevent. Lady Colin Campbell is said to have been making this case for years, long before the subject became popular online. She has written and spoken in detail about the irregularities surrounding Meghan's pregnancies, and she has done so with a level of specificity that makes dismissal harder. Her observations about the visible presentation of the pregnancies have remained consistent. The bump, she says, seemed to behave in ways that pregnancy bumps simply do not. She has stated plainly that whatever was going on, it was not normal. At the same time, she is portrayed as careful to distinguish between what she knows and what she suspects. Her larger constitutional point stands on its own. In her view, the people of Britain and of every realm where King Charles III is head of state have an absolute right to verifiable assurance that anyone who stands a realistic chance of sitting on the throne is legitimately entitled to do so. This is presented not as a suggested right, but as an absolute one. According to the narrative, that right is not being honored. The necessary assurance is not being provided, and the authorities who have failed to provide it are said to be creating conditions for division rather than harmony. It is even claimed that some people now ask whether the children are real at all. Meghan's conduct is described as having put the royal family in a no-win situation, one in which her targets are left to lose either way, while she herself is unable to turn the outcome of her maneuvers into anything genuinely positive. Lady Colin Campbell's explanation for the palace's silence is presented as more complicated than a simple institutional cover-up. The palace, she argues, operates under the same legal and constitutional constraints as everyone else. In a constitutional democracy, a head of state cannot take unilateral action against someone merely because public suspicion exists, no matter how widespread or emotionally compelling that suspicion may be. The palace cannot simply declare that questions have been raised and demand answers. The law does not work that way, and neither does the Constitution. If the royal family behaved as though it could act in that manner, it might create a constitutional crisis even greater than the one it was trying to solve. Yet there is another layer to the silence as well. If the palace were to take any action that even indirectly acknowledged that the birth questions were valid, it would open a door that might be impossible to close. The story would gain legitimacy and momentum. That, it is suggested, is why a calculation has been made that saying nothing is less costly than saying something. Lady Colin Campbell believes that calculation is a mistake. In her view, the silence itself is damaging the institution's credibility, weakening public trust, and eroding the sense that the royal family can deal honestly with the concerns of the people it is meant to serve. She predicts that when a resolution finally comes, it will not arrive through a formal inquiry or a clear public statement. Instead, it will come quietly through other means. Harry and the children, she suggests, will eventually be removed from the positions that make the constitutional question urgent. Titles will go, the line of succession will be adjusted, and the whole issue will be made irrelevant without ever being directly answered. She acknowledges that this would not amount to justice or to the clear and open resolution the public is actually asking for, but she suggests it may be the most the institution believes it can manage. A major source of frustration in this story is said to be the silence of the mainstream media. Lady Colin Campbell's analysis is that Britain's royal correspondents operate within a system that depends on maintaining good relations with the palace press office. Their careers depend on access, on being kept in good standing, and on not alienating the institution that feeds them information and invitations. Because of this, they have strong incentives to avoid exactly the sort of story that the palace would find most uncomfortable. A story questioning the legitimacy of Meghan's pregnancies is described as perhaps the most untouchable story in the whole royal sphere. So, according to the transcript, the royal press pack largely chose not to go there at all. They left the subject to commentators outside the system, then turned around and dismissed those same commentators as conspiracy theorists. The result, in Lady Colin Campbell's view, is a particularly neat way of having it both ways: refuse to investigate, then use the lack of mainstream investigation as proof that nothing was worth investigating. Now that Hugo Vickers, someone with impeccable establishment standing, has raised similar questions, it is suggested that the press will find a way to dismiss him as well. They may call him a mouthpiece for the king or invent some other reason to evade his concerns. The reason, according to the narrative, is that engaging seriously with what he has said would require admitting that these questions were always worth asking. That would amount to a reckoning of its own. In this account, the whole matter smells rotten. Meghan's behavior is said to have placed the royal family in an impossible position. That is why people are again encouraged to continue writing to the palace, because the greater the volume of public pressure, the harder it may become to ignore the issue. Lady Colin Campbell's own ties to the institution are highlighted as evidence that she should not be dismissed as a figure on the margins. She is described as the first person to examine the Harry and Meghan saga properly in print, and it is also claimed that the late Queen personally nominated her to produce commemorative stamps for the 10 nations of which she was head of state. Yet despite such ties, the press still treats her as though she exists outside serious royal life, because taking her seriously would mean asking the questions it has chosen not to ask. The cost of that silence is described as real. It has created a vacuum in which the public, lacking credible mainstream coverage, has gone looking for information elsewhere. Honest and rigorous journalism might have managed the story better, but instead there is now a wider feeling that the press, like the palace, is not quite telling the whole truth. That sense of institutional opacity, spread across the palace, the media, and the political establishment, is portrayed as deeply corrosive. Once the constitutional language and historical references are stripped away, the story is said to become one about character, about who Meghan Markle is, what she has been prepared to do, and what consequences her choices have had for the people and institutions around her. Lady Colin Campbell is said to have described the conduct surrounding these births as behavior more reminiscent of a hustling operator than a woman of good and regal repute. It is framed as a deliberate exploitation of the good faith of institutions that trusted her. This pattern, she argues, is not limited to the birth questions. It is presented as something visible throughout Meghan's life. There are always casualties. Her father, old friends, her first husband, palace staff who came and went in unusual numbers, and business ventures that launched with great noise and then quietly vanished are all cited as examples. The sharp observation offered is that she does damage but cannot truly collect the reward. She overturns everything around her but fails to build anything lasting from the wreckage. The narrative then turns to Prince William. According to multiple sources, it is now said to be a matter of when, not if, he strips Harry and Meghan of their royal titles. At the same time, the fact that Hugo Vickers and Lady Colin Campbell have many connections in common is used to reinforce the claim that this subject has been a running sore within the royal family for years. If someone like Hugo Vickers is now willing to confirm the seriousness of the issue, the implication is that the pressure inside the story has reached almost unbearable levels. That naturally leads to a simple question: what was the plan, and what did any of this actually achieve? Not royal acceptance, which disappeared faster than expected. Not lasting public sympathy, which has largely turned. Not a stable career, since the brand ventures have stumbled, the projects have stalled, and the grand promises have not become the empire once projected. Not peace and privacy, because scrutiny has not faded with time. It has intensified every time a fresh inconsistency has surfaced. Harry is portrayed as occupying one of the most painful positions in the entire story. At 41 years old, living in California, he is increasingly distant from the institution that made him and shaped him. Yet he still carries that world inside him. He may never have expected to find himself at the center of questions about whether his children's births were genuine, but that is where he now stands. And the account insists that there is no clean way out for him. If he remains where he is, the questions will continue to follow him. Every interview, every public appearance, every carefully managed image pulls the unresolved questions back into view. The life he built in California, with podcasts, streaming deals, speaking engagements, and the image of a man who walked away from privilege on principle, exists under the shadow of questions he has never answered and seems unwilling to answer. If the marriage were to unravel, the situation would not become simpler. The transcript suggests that serious commentary increasingly points to a quiet but significant divergence in the couple's goals. If there were legal proceedings in California or a formal dissolution of the Sussex partnership, the birth questions could be dragged into an entirely new arena. Lawyers, depositions, public filings, and court documents could become part of the permanent record. The machinery of California family law is described as more transparent and more thorough than the carefully controlled world of royal communications is prepared to handle. Details that have so far remained within the relatively managed space of royal commentary could suddenly fall under the harsh scrutiny of an American courtroom. In that sense, Harry is portrayed not only as geographically trapped, but also as trapped by the accumulated weight of his own choices, and by a narrative that has hardened around him. Another point raised is the world in which Harry grew up. He was raised inside one of the most protocol-driven institutions on Earth. He saw the births of his nephews and nieces, surrounded by the formal machinery of royal procedure, with witnesses, announcements, and carefully sequenced processes that had governed royal births for centuries. That is why the argument insists he knows at the deepest level what proper royal birth protocol looks like. And if he knows that, then he also knows what a departure from that protocol looks like. Whether he has fully allowed himself to confront the implications of that is another matter, but the suggestion that he might be living in complete ignorance of the storm around him is treated as implausible. The role of the media is then examined once more in wider terms. Britain's Royal Press Corps is described as one of the most experienced and best resourced specialist fields in journalism. These are not inexperienced reporters stumbling across difficult material. They are people who understand the protocols, the constitutional frameworks, and the institutional landscape. They have had both the knowledge and the access needed to pursue the very questions Lady Colin Campbell and Hugo Vickers have been raising publicly, yet they did not pursue them. Questions about the birth timeline, about the missing witness signatures, and about announcements that did not appear to align with medical reality were not given serious, sustained investigative treatment by the mainstream royal press. The story was left to voices outside the system, and those voices were then brushed aside as fringe. The arrangement is described as convenient and self-sustaining. The press declines to investigate, then treats the absence of mainstream investigation as evidence that there is no real story there. The force driving that arrangement is access. Royal correspondents depend on palace briefings, invitations, and institutional goodwill. Journalists who aggressively pursue stories that the palace finds most uncomfortable may find those relationships cooling, those invitations disappearing, and that access quietly withdrawn. In this view, the incentive structure does not reward courage, it rewards discretion. That is why this particular story is said to have exposed a press corps so committed to discretion that it has effectively surrendered its role as a check on institutional power. Hugo Vickers changes that dynamic precisely because his standing does not depend in the same way on the palace press office. His reputation rests on scholarship, long-established relationships, and decades of credible work. For a man like that to speak publicly means in this account that the anomalies have become too serious for silence to remain the right response. Lady Colin Campbell's response to his intervention is presented not as triumphant, but as grimly vindicated. She has spent years enduring mockery and dismissal while maintaining the same basic position. Now that Hugo Vickers has entered the conversation, it reveals that the story has moved into territory that the establishment can no longer dismiss as easily as before. Dismissing Lady Colin Campbell had depended on presenting her as an outlier, a singular and idiosyncratic voice with personal reasons to doubt Meghan Markle. That strategy becomes far harder once the same questions are raised by a quietly authoritative royal historian with ties to the late Queen and a reputation for getting things right. At that point, dismissing the messenger begins to look less like caution and more like deliberate blindness. In the end, the story returns to the question of institutional trust. Archie and Lilibet's births matter in this account because they are in the line of succession, and that line is not merely symbolic but legally and constitutionally significant. The safeguards that existed for more than 3 centuries were meant to ensure that trust rested on documented evidence rather than assumptions. The people who dismantled those safeguards are said to have forgotten that institutions are only as trustworthy as the people inside them, and the people inside them change. The warming pan scandal is invoked as a reminder that unresolved doubt does not fade away simply because institutions remain silent. It grows. The people writing letters to the palace today are not living in 1689, but the underlying dynamic is presented as hauntingly similar, doubt that cannot be resolved because no credible institutional answer has been given. Prince William is said to understand this and to be working toward a solution that removes the constitutional urgency without requiring a public confrontation. Titles may be stripped, succession rights altered, and the constitutional question made irrelevant even if the personal and historical questions remain alive. That may be a solution in a narrow constitutional sense, but the account insists it will not restore the trust that has been lost. The people writing those letters are not asking only about legality. They are asking whether the institutions they have trusted are still capable of honesty, and a quiet administrative solution, however elegant, does not answer that question. It only steps around it. The final argument is that every time an institution chooses managed silence over honest engagement, it makes a withdrawal from a limited reserve of public trust. Trust, whether in the monarchy or any other institution, is not endless. It regenerates slowly and can be depleted quickly. The monarchy has survived for centuries not because it has always been flawless, but because at certain moments it has shown the ability to face reality and adapt. When it has chosen denial instead, history has judged it harshly. According to this narrative, this story is now part of the historical record. The questions are public, the documentary anomalies are public, the scale of public concern is measurable. Future historians will not ask only what happened, but how the institutions responded when it happened. Lady Colin Campbell's warning is that the overblown balloon is close to bursting. The pressure inside the story has been building for years, fed by every unanswered question and every month of institutional silence. Hugo Vickers speaking out, the organized volume of public correspondence, and the fact that this conversation is now happening openly, with establishment voices attached to it, are all presented as evidence that the old management strategy is reaching its limit. What comes next remains uncertain. There could be a quiet institutional resolution that makes the constitutional questions moot without answering them. There could be a more dramatic unraveling driven by legal, personal, or political events. There could even be an unexpected moment of honesty from somewhere within the establishment that changes the shape of the whole story. What no longer seems possible, in this account, is that the story will simply disappear on its own. At the deepest level, the question this story raises is not just about succession, titles, or royal procedure. It is about what people are willing to accept from the institutions that govern their lives and claim their loyalty. When power chooses silence over honesty, when managing discomfort becomes more important than telling the truth, and when a clean resolution and an honest resolution become two different things, which one will people accept? That is the question this narrative says has been there from the beginning beneath all the headlines, gossip, and constitutional complexity. And it insists that honest answers are owed not only by the institutions involved, but also by everyone watching the story unfold.